Hello, literacy leaders and champions. Welcome to Literacy Talks, a podcast series from Reading Horizons, dedicated to exploring the ideas, trends, insights, and practical issues that will help us all improve our professional practice, knowledge, and confidence in teaching reading. Our host is Stacy Hurst, professor at Southern Utah University and chief academic advisor at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Joining Stacy are Donnell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, an author, speaker, and a first-grade elementary reading teacher. Today's episode is part 2 of our 4-part mini-series as we unpack Ending the Reading Wars, Reading Acquisition from Novice to Expert by Kathleen Rastle and Nation. From cracking the alphabetic code and important background on the writing system to phonics myths and instructional tips, there's a lot of literacy landscape to travel. Let's get started.
Welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. My name is Stacy Hurst. I'm the host, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Donnell Pons and Lindsay Kemeny. And if you listen to our last episode, we are on part 2 of a 4-part series about the article called Ending the Reading Wars, Reading Acquisition from Novice to Expert by Ann Castles, Kathleen Rastle, and Kate Nation, otherwise known as Castles, Rastle, and Nation. Just fun to say. I think we established that. Today, we are going to be talking about Section 1, Cracking the Alphabetic Code, pages 8 through 16 if you have the document. And if you listen to our last episode, we linked the document, so you should have access to that. And we have lots of exciting things to talk about today, Lindsay and Donnell. We're going to start with a little bit of a background from them about the importance of the writing system. And then we'll be covering some tips that they give for instruction. They have a lot of really great questions that they mention that we still don't know about this aspect of reading. And of course, we get to cover the myths about phonics instruction, which I'm looking forward to. Donnell, Lindsay, overall, anything stand out to you in this one?
I just love that box that they have with the myths of phonics. And so I'm excited to talk about that.
I really love the beginning with the cracking the alphabetic code when it talks about the difference between spoken language and written. And I think that one paragraph right under cracking the alphabetic code, if you just read that paragraph, would be very helpful to a lot of educators and parents. It's broken down so well.
That's one thing I love about this article. It just puts into the best possible combination of words the way to describe these things. And I think we mentioned this last time too, but you can tell the authors have a sense of humor because of the quotes that they insert, like from Steven Pinker, when Donnell, they're talking about the difference between learning to speak and learning to read. And they're quoting him as saying, there is almost no way to prevent it from happening, meaning students learning how to talk. And here comes the kind of funny part, short of raising a child in a barrel, which is just an interesting visual. But
researcher humor.
Yes.
The other thing I really liked is there's the next sentence. Well, it's a sentence after. Although reading is a heritable trait influenced by multiple genes interacting with environmental factors in complex ways, it is nevertheless a learned skill that typically requires years of instruction and practice. Wow. Just that sentence right there for understanding, right?
Pretty clarifying, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
I actually highlighted this part too, because I think it does get to the point quite nicely. The challenge of reading is to learn to associate arbitrary visual symbols, patterns of lines, curves, and dots with those meanings, with the word meanings, like we do with spoken words. So we have lots of experience, the three of us, teaching people how to read and using this writing system to do so. That section 1.1 gives a nice overview, I'd say, too, of kind of the history. Well, they just mentioned that writing is a recent cultural invention and that all writing systems are kind of code for spoken language. Any insights in that section that you thought were noteworthy?
I just love how it helps to distill, if you've heard that teaching children the code or whatever, it helps you to understand what that means and what it means to crack the code, right? Is to get what the letters do with the sounds and how that applies to this particular language. I thought that was really great too.
And Lindsay, you and I have taught littles to learn how to read in English, but they also mention other writing systems and the history of those. And they call out alphabetic, syllabic, and morphophonetic. And then this is just a fun little fact, but they're giving an example of how spoken Mandarin Chinese is characterized by just a small number of syllables and consequently a high number of homophones. But they're talking about, they give an example of a troublesome instance of this. They're words obviously with different meanings, but are pronounced the same way. So you really do have to know the context. But they say a troublesome instance of this is the word, I'm going to slaughter it. I don't know how to pronounce anything. I don't know the phonemes in Mandarin Chinese. It's spelled SI, which means both the number 4 and death. No problem there. Which is why it's quite common for hotels in China to skip from the 3rd floor to the 5th.
Yeah.
What did you think of that?
Oh, yeah. That was just so interesting. Yeah.
I also think that's a really good point for when we're working with speakers of other languages that are learning English. Context, even more important, right? Because you don't realize what context is for them in their original primary language and how meaningful it is in learning another language. That's another reason why context when we're teaching. And
again, especially when we're focusing on that meaning, that's the important thing. Okay, this is what I thought was really interesting. And actually, as you know, I use this article in some of my coursework with my students. But it literally took me a few times of reading it to really notice how poignant this part is. And to you too, it's going to be like, well, that's obvious, Stacey. But they mention this. A crucial point is that most appropriate way to learn, they're talking about mapping sounds to the symbols, is governed not by pedagogical philosophy, but by the nature of the writing system the child needs to learn. So I'm thinking there is no debate here. We need to teach the phoneme grapheme correspondences. I don't know of anybody that teaches reading that says we shouldn't. But as we have talked a lot about teaching whole words as opposed to the individual graphemes and the sounds they represent.
The fear by those that are against explicit phonics instruction, I guess, is that we're putting that ahead of meaning. But you can see here, I mean, in that first paragraph, it's talking about how you're connecting these things with meaning all along. We're not neglecting meaning and just creating word collars. We are attending to meaning as we also explicitly teach the letter sound correspondences.
And because of the nature of the English writing system, you have to know those to access that information and meaning. Yeah. So it really is critical. And then they call out a term, Donnell, I know you're really familiar with this, paired associate learning tasks. If we don't teach it that way, then we are putting a lot on them cognitively to memorize words as a whole and the way they look. Again, this is, to us, is stating the obvious, but they do make mention that that kind of a strategy is useful for a relatively small number of words, but it's hard to imagine memorizing tens of thousands of words that way. And they also call out that if we teach phoneme grapheme correspondences, students are more likely to make other connections. Like if we teach the word vet, then it will be easier for them to learn a word like vow because of the consonant that's the same, or van. And then they bring up orthographic depth. What do you guys think of that concept?
Yeah, it's definitely true of English, right? We have a really complex orthography, whereas other languages are maybe very consistent. Like here are the 5 vowels and they always represent these 5 different sounds. We have 18 vowel sounds and multiple ways to spell them. And there's so many layers to English, like the etymology, the history of the word.
Yeah, which is something that's useful for those of us who are teaching reading in English to know, right? Because I think we're always compared. I used to hate this. We always get compared to Finland.
Yeah.
You notice that?
Uh-huh.
And their literacy rates. But when you learn that their orthography is so shallow, they literally have one sound, one symbol, and it takes their students about a year to learn to read. So they can even wait till what we would call first grade to start teaching reading. We can't because we have a little bit more complex of a code. Yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. Donnell, anything? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to add, I just think our language is so interesting. So, because there's reasons, a lot of times it's so fun to find out the reason a word is spelled the way it is, or the reason we retained that spelling, like you have sign, S-I-G-N, and that's related to signature. You hear the G there. And so it just makes sense to me why we kept certain spellings, even though we changed how we pronounce them, because it shows the relationships among the words.
And that's because we have a morphophonemic language, right? So some of those spellings are determined by the meaningful parts of the word.
And I think this also gives a nod to why those sound spelling walls, rather than just calling it a sound wall, sound spelling walls are also so useful and effective, right? And if done well, when you organize things, there's a real base or a foundation that students can anchor in terms of how the students learn the progression of sounds with grapheme, appropriate grapheme. And then as with development, they add additional graphemes. The organization is as important as understanding the depth of the orthography, right? It's that's key to everything. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like a filing system. Once you understand that, then your brain can file the information where it needs to go so you can readily access it. It definitely makes all the sense in the world once you understand it, which has taken me a while. And then they do call out that 80% of English monosyllables can be pronounced using a relatively small set of rules relating graphemes to phonemes. In the remaining 20% of cases, typically only one grapheme deviates from its most frequent pronunciation. So they're called, they'll get into this, but we need to teach the most frequent phoneme grapheme correspondences. The really interesting thing that I thought they mentioned here is that most of that work on those sound spelling relationships have been conducted with single syllable words, which made sense to me as I was reading. I was thinking, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But then it says researchers are only just beginning to consider spelling sound relations in letter strings with more than one syllable. And that immediately makes me start thinking of Erie's phases and then how we separate words into syllables. And I think there's been a lot of conversation about that lately as well.
With that quote on the 80% of the, single syllables are consistent. In other words, English is not so crazy that we just throw our hands up and say, oh, why teach it? It's just crazy. No, look how many of those sound spellings are consistent and reliable.
If any of my students listen to this podcast, this will be familiar to them. I threaten them. I'm like, if I ever hear you say after this class that English is crazy, I will be on the news because of my reaction to that. You better not tell your students because they don't need to know that, right? And that makes sense, though, because if we're teaching the most consistent phoneme grapheme correspondences, and then we layer on explanations of those spelling that may not follow directly, it just starts making sense for students and clicking. And then we've got things going rather than saying English is crazy. Why even bother, right?
Something I think is interesting. My son, I think I've talked about, he had a very difficult road to reading, and dyslexia being part of the story, the challenge. And now in adulthood, he'd love to hear me calling him an adult. That's so great. I hope he hears that. In his early 20s. But it's interesting because he now he's able to put words to things that he felt when he was younger, learning to read. And it's been really interesting to hear him give me kind of a narrative of what it felt like. One of the things that he said about when we were discussing English, going over spelling, and he said, you had such confidence that you could explain it, and you were willing to take the time to listen to my challenge and my question, and then find a way to explain it to me that made it seem very understandable. And he said that was fantastic, because up to that point, it was, oh, it's crazy, it's wacky, any of those number of words you hear people say, I don't know why They said you would take the time and you had a confidence that, no, we know why. Let's talk about this. We can figure it out. And he said, yeah, that was half of the battle right there, was just to have that confidence behind, no, there's an answer for this. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. There are more explanations than exceptions.
Yeah.
Far more. They mentioned one that I thought was interesting. We know this, we teach it, that sometimes EA can make the sound of short E, like in the word bread instead. And there are very few words, a few enough that you could just teach the words that is the case in. But they call out that if you teach something like those combinations are usually followed by the letter D, then it just makes that even more consistent, right? Then they have an option to be flexible when they get to a word with that spelling, when they're trying to figure out the pronunciation.
Okay, but we're not skipping the alphabetic principle section, right? Because I wanted to talk about that.
No, we're not.
Okay, we're not there yet. Right.
I do want to mention before we get there, and that's section 1.2, by the way, but I like the paragraph that kind of sums up the previous section.
Okay.
Although orthographic depth affects the time taken to learn the sound to spelling mapping, it seems to be the same cognitively what is required in any language that is European in nature. So even though we're teaching English, any language that is similar, you still need to teach those sound spelling correspondences. So we can talk a little bit about sounds, but then you have to attach those to symbols, right? So this is where the alphabetic principle comes in. Lindsay, I know you have something to say about this.
Well, I loved it. At the very beginning, it's talking about students don't learn the alphabetic principle on their own. It's not natural. And they have this study they talk about where it was pre-literate students, like preschoolers, 3 to 5, and they would show them written words like fat and bat. They were taught to read those. And then they were given a transfer task. For example, they'd have fun. And then they were asked, is the word fun or bun? After they had learned, the words fat and bat. And there were 80 students in the experiments, and none of them succeeded on the transfer task. None of them. And it just, I love that. They said their children showed no evidence of inducing the alphabetic principle. I love that because it points out that we have to explicitly teach them this. It's not going to happen naturally. And you hear over and over adults or youth, teenagers who don't know this, and they find out, wait a minute, these symbols represent a sound. PH represents, why didn't anyone tell me this? This is what happens when sometimes we start with these like whole word approaches and we're not, systematically, explicitly teaching these little points that you might think they are going to figure out on their own, but most of them will not.
And I don't know about you, but as a pre-service teacher, I was literally taught that you don't have to spend a ton of time on this. You just have to surround students with text. And once they know a few of those correspondences, they'll generalize them. Now, this study did say that if you're teaching those sound symbol correspondences, they're more likely to generalize, like the task you just described, but we can't assume it. We know what happens when we do.
I thought this was really interesting because in the adult space, that's where I'm hanging out, right? And working with people. And consistently, adults will attempt to read unfamiliar words. And there are all levels of literacy that I encounter. They will attempt, when pushed against a wall, like, I don't know this word, they will attempt to read with the letter name. And when you back up the bus and say, letter sound for reading, and you've done work with the sounds, the whole thing shifts. But it's just interesting to see what they're attempting to do on their own. So what are you using on your own to get through a word that you don't know? And they are going by letter name. And trust me, that is not a way to try to get through reading in a world when you're an adult. That's not a great way to do things. But consistently, that's what's happening. So we're talking right here about this very thing, the alphabetic code.
Yeah. Even with older learners, it's so critical. And this is one of my favorite sentences in that section when they sum up that study. Reliable success on the transfer task was typically achieved only when children were trained such that they could segment phonemes in spoken words and identify their initial phonemes, and B, recognize the graphic symbols that correspond to the key sounds in the transfer task. So I know we're not to the section of instruction yet, but that's what we need to be teaching, right?
Exactly. So what do they need to gain the alphabetic principle? They need to be able to segment and identify the first sound in words, and then they need knowledge of the letter sounds.
Yep. And critical also for older learners as well.
Yes.
And I think I've heard the alphabetic principle described somewhere else as an insight. And I think there's two parts to that, right? It is the understanding of what the alphabetic principle is, that insight, but then the actual information that goes into being able to make those sound symbol correspondences.
These are not small things. When you're asking an older learner who has worked with this for decades and has not been able to crack the code, when you start really honing in and pinpointing these things, segmenting, blending, and it immediately becomes apparent that that was never a skill that this student ever achieved, not even an insight, really.
Yeah. Do you know what? I know in my own students who are going to be teachers, that is always revelatory to them, honestly, because they've been speaking and reading and writing for so long that they don't think of it on those levels. I always say our automaticity gets in the way of our instruction sometimes, and I think that's a case in point.
Yeah.
Then speaking of that, they transition nicely. They mention the Aries phases too, specifically when we're talking about the alphabetic principle and phoneme grapheme correspondences, the partial alphabetic phase and the full alphabetic phase. Can I just say that as an educator, I cannot overstate the importance of that research that Dr. Airy has done. Those phases are so critical to learning how to recognize words automatically. So we're looking at partial phases. The partial phases when students are able to recognize with their spelling, they're spelling some of those sounds, but maybe not all of them. In the full alphabetic phase, they're representing every sound in a word, even if the grapheme is incorrect. And those are things we're looking for as teachers. So I think that's important. And they mention it. They don't go fully into it, but they're going to talk about that, I think, later too. Okay, so we are to the implementation or implications for the classroom. What stood out to you guys in this section?
Well, the phonics miss, but is that a little bit more? Do we have a little?
That is soon.
Down a little bit.
Yeah, we're on page 12. And for those who are following along too, 1.4.
Lindsay's anxious to get to those.
I know. I think we all are.
Well, I'm just like, okay, that stood out.
Good.
What else stood out? There's another part that stood out, but I think it's a little bit, it reminded me of the Scher's self-teaching hypothesis when it's saying that teaching students a limited set of the grapheme phoneme correspondences, when they're taught really well early on, they put them on the path to independent reading, where they are going to gain some of those more complex phonics concepts through their text experience. So I just thought that reminded me of the self-teaching hypothesis. They have the basis of the code and they can start to kind of figure the other stuff out as they experience it.
Yeah. They also mentioned vocabulary is important in that process too, to access the meaning. Donna.
So within that systematic phonics instruction, this is so important and vital for all learners, but particularly adult learners, because they're like Swiss cheese, right? There are holes everywhere. And there is no other way than to go back and figure out where you need to fill in, right? And that's systematic, explicit instruction that allows you to be able to do that, to go back and trust me, you can be built on a shaky foundation and be able to do a few things, but you don't have everything and you're not fully automatic. You're not completely fluent. You have challenges. And so going back and being able to fill in, and that's done because it's systematic and explicit.
So us lower grade teachers, that's really on us. Have a solid phonics scope and sequence that you're following to make sure that we don't have this Swiss cheese effect. Of course, some students are going to need more practice with that, but starting that right away in your tier 1 and following up with extra practice in small group for students who need it is going to be key.
Love it. And then they also mentioned the National Reading Panel findings, which at this point, to some of us, are old news, but they're still relevant. And I thought it was useful that they pointed out that in those studies that were mentioned in the National Reading Panel, when phonics instruction in a systematic and sequential way began in the first grade, it improved decoding, spelling, and text comprehension. Now we know that as students get older, language comprehension plays more of a role perhaps than decoding. But they also said more recently, 2 meta-analyses have been conducted that conclude that phonics instruction is an effective intervention for poor readers, no matter their age, and that there's benefits on spelling as well. And as you guys probably know, in England, they mentioned also they did a meta-analysis, the Rose Report. And as a result of that, which was one of the findings, was how important phonics instruction is. They started giving an assessment in England every year to their students. The whole country takes it. And what I thought was cool was they described the test and then they mentioned some of the results in this section, which I always wondered about. So the check requires children to read 20 words and 20 non-words aloud. The non-words are critical to assess pure spelling to sound knowledge, which we refer to those sometimes as nonsense words, without any impact of memory for individual words. And then they state that since 2012, when the test was introduced, 58% of their students passed in 2012, 69% in 2013, 74% in 2014, 77% in 2015, 81% in 2016, and 81% in 2017. Any thoughts about those numbers?
I don't know. I guess I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
Because I think, yes, they're doing the thing, right?
And it matches what we know about an MTSS model, right? We learn that 80% of students in that tier with tier 1 instruction can respond if it's good, high quality tier 1 instruction. And that's representative of that. And that's pre-COVID. So I'm not sure what their data looks like since then.
And a nice reminder while we're in this section too, to think about, likewise, if I have a student that I've moved too quickly, I know where to go because I know where I've been in order to go back and say, maybe we moved a little too quickly from where we were. And usually I can find that place where, yep, this was just a little too quick. We need a little more time here. So again, it's each student too. We're going back to that beginning phrase to this whole section that, sentences that they said about there's a heritability factor, there's the environment factor. So we're all moving at different, right? We might require different things. And that's where that small group instruction and being able to know exactly where you've been with a student to where you want to go with a student to allow that time to be able to pick up these skills. And I think that's the real sweet spot right in there too with instruction.
Yeah. And assessment is part of that instruction.
Yes.
I know they also make mention of this. In the United States, we have different states that we have local, locus of control when it comes to education. So we don't have a nationwide test for like phonics, for example. I think every state does something different with screening, but in Utah, we do Acadience, and there's no phonics screener in that. A phonics screener would be more diagnostic at that point. So we screen them with oral reading fluency and some nonsense word fluency tasks. But there are some really great free phonics screeners out there that I would recommend any teacher to use. The Core Phonics survey is one of my favorites. If you've taken letters, there's a spelling inventory that is helpful there. Do any of you have any other tools that you use for that?
Those are the two that I use.
I think Really Great Reading has a phonics survey too.
But just being aware of what they are too. And in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade spaces, being aware of what those are for your students too, right? And not losing track that a student may not be one and done by 3rd grade.
And I know at least the Core Phonics survey, they have pseudo words and real words so that you're not, especially with older students who have learned to recognize some of these words in print, whether they can spell them or not. And sometimes I will say, if your student can accurately recognize these words, you might want to give them a few of the real words, ask them to spell them, and see how they do with that.
Educators, families, policymakers, and our communities at large are all focused on coming together to help all children develop reading proficiency. That's why you'll want to learn more about the new Reading Horizons Discovery. It's the evidence-based foundational literacy program educators asked for and educators helped create. With innovative technology to support teachers and students, a complete collection of decodable books, a digital sound wall, real-time coaching, and more, Reading Horizons Discovery gives you everything you need to help all K-3 students become proficient readers. So, take off with a trusted Science of Reading aligned approach. Stay on top of student progress and individual needs with a tech-enabled tool and streamlined student data. And then take action to transform reading challenges into literacy success. Go to readinghorizons.com/product guide to download a complete program overview today.
So, Stacey, you've made me think about something with these statistics that you read before, and then you got done with them. Do you have any thoughts? And we said, well, yeah, but also, do we have any really good? And again, we've got COVID hanging out in this whole situation as well. We have to recognize, but do we have any really good studies yet that have indicated, and do we have any places where this has been done well enough that have indicated that, yep, once we've implemented phonics in a certain way, we do see later comprehension improvements. So down the road for those students, great. Because this is early, right? This real influence in the K-3 space. This is pretty early days.
The only research that I know, I don't know, I can't cite it, but I think there's a larger impact on comprehension if a student can accurately and fluently decode in grades K-2. And beyond that, that's where that language comprehension makes more of a difference. But it's still essential, right? We know, Anita Archer says it all the time, there's no strategy that can compensate for not being able to read the words.
I just wanted to point out, I don't think this was in the article, but I just was thinking about it, that this phonics instruction, I think, is so beneficial also for our strong readers. Because a lot of times, we think, oh, this student can already read, they don't need phonics, but you watch them spell. And a lot of them need these phonics concepts to help their spelling. And it doesn't, like, some people worry it's boring for them. I don't see that my strong readers are bored in our phonics lessons. In fact, they're the ones that are usually like kind of eating up this information. Like, they love to learn, oh, English words don't end with V. Oh my gosh, that's so interesting. And they love this stuff. And I do think there's a study, I can't think of it right now, but it was I believe it was second grade. And they found that phonics instruction showed, benefits for the strong readers as well. So don't just think your students who struggle with reading are the ones who need phonics. It's really beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, my students currently most of them are proficient readers, and they are so into this. They get so excited about it. Let's get to the myths before we don't. I do want to mention, though, that next section talks about some questions that we still have unanswered when it comes to teaching. Read it. It's very interesting. One that I think was noteworthy was, how much of the code do we need to teach? We still don't know that. Yeah. So we start, how far along do we need to get into the minutia of some sound spelling correspondences that are very rare? What is the best use of instructional time? I thought that was a great question.
Yeah. And along those lines, also just comparing phonics programs that teach like the single grapheme phoneme mappings, like, okay, O is oo, and then another day they're going to say, oh, it can also spell versus phonics programs that will teach multiple, sounds for that spelling at a time. And it's just saying, like, we need more research on that, right? So, you're going to have different programs doing different things, and people are going to say what they think, but those are their opinions, as far as I know, that we need more research in that area.
Yeah, I loved that they called that out, right? I think that's really important. They had some other great questions involving sight words, meaning high frequency words, and including those in instruction, and also decodable text, which I think we know. We've done an episode on that. Feel free to look back on that, listen to that one again. But there is some research that we still need to know, especially when it comes to how much, how often,
And something that stuck out to me in that decodable text part was it saying, once children move beyond the early stages of reading, the benefits of decodable readers are likely to be outweighed by their limitations. And more research is needed to determine when this tipping point occurs. So we don't want to keep them in decodable text too long. This is like our tipping the boat episode we did, where we kind of overcorrect sometimes. We overcorrect and only keep them in decodables, but they should be used for a short amount of time.
That syntax being challenging for one thing, right? And for the ear of a reader. Yeah, very good.
Oh, great point. Yeah, they do talk about the limitations of that too. Also, the types of words, the quality of words you're exposing them to may be limited to. Okay, myths. We have 4. Phonics teaches children to read non-words or words they've never seen, right?
Exactly.
New words.
That could be a non-word.
Yeah. So they list the evidence for that. And then they also have a reference. So if you have that conversation come up with your coworkers, which I have before, it's nice to be able to say, hey, here's some research.
I don't get sometimes why it's so hard. I don't know why it's so hard for people to understand. And then they're going to, we're going to use these for assessment. We're seeing if they can blend. If they can't read the word cack, how are they going to read the word cactus? Right?
Maybe they've seen some egregious things happening with nonsense words, long lists, right? And using it as a function that it shouldn't be used as, right? And doesn't have a performance.
It's the overcorrection thing again.
Yeah, right? That's true. Yeah. And I have refined my practice when it comes to this. Ever since I read the National Reading Panel, I've been using non-words in my assessment and in my instruction as a form of assessment. But I have ceased. I don't ask students to spell non-words anymore. I use it for reading only. So, and I don't know if there's research about that, but it kind of makes sense to me.
Right. And the whole spelling, you're putting a word in context when you have, it's just kind of interesting.
And meaning is even more important if you're expressing it, not necessarily just receptively reading it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Myth number 2, phonics interferes with reading comprehension. Now, I can say I've heard this before because sometimes students take a while to sound things out. What do you guys have to say about that?
They have to go through that process in order to be able to code quickly, automatically, so they can attend to meeting.
We go slow to go fast.
Yeah,
exactly. Otherwise, you're guessing and going.
And it's that self-teaching hypothesis. It's that too. You need enough data before you become automatic with it. And honestly, they link to some really, no pun intended, hardy research, because one of the researchers, Perfetti and Hart, but also Erie's research is so solid here. And she did a 2001 meta-analysis that found that children taught by systematic phonics method made gains in text comprehension as well as word reading and spelling. All the things, right? Okay, English is too irregular for phonics to be of value. Anything else to add to that? English is not crazy, people.
Yeah.
I guess we summed it up, right? More explanations than exceptions. And then they do refer to Cher as well here, not the singer, but the researcher, spelled differently.
See?
Homophonic. Is that a word? I don't know. Now I'm making stuff up. Okay. And finally, which speaks to the final myth, phonics is boring for children and turns them off of reading. Why do you think this is a myth? Why do you think people even say that?
Well, I think a lot of teachers think it's boring, and they think those texts that they have to read are boring, which, okay, to be fair, there are some horrible decodable ones out there, but but there's better and better ones out there. And it's what you bring to it and how you teach it, and you're keeping a perky pace and you're showing excitement, and you're not just up there doing everything. Very interactive. So students are engaged. And so, if you think phonics is boring, yep, your students probably will, because you're coming at it with that attitude. You've got to come at it with a better attitude.
And what's even more boring? Not knowing how to take the words apart, not having a clue where to begin. That's even more boring. And I've got students who talk about sitting out in the hall, most of first, second, and third grade, because nobody knew, quote, what to do with them. And that's worse than boring.
I think it's only boring if you don't get it. I do.
Don't get how to do it, you mean?
Yeah. If you can't crack the code, then it's hard.
I just think pacing is so important too. You've got to kind of pay attention to your students and then, okay, we've done that. We're moving on to this, right? We're not going to stay with one thing for 20 minutes, So it's that pacing is really important in your phonics lessons.
Yeah, it is definitely where the art of teaching needs to intersect with the art and science of reading, right?
Yeah, it's keeping an eye on your students, right? That's another thing, because it can be very boring for the student whose needs aren't being met.
Great point. And, I can share anecdotally something that started happening in my school when we started it was Reading Horizons Discovery. My teachers would say, we'd be in the faculty room at lunch or whatever, and they'd say, you know what? I asked my students what their favorite time of day was, and the students were like, we like phonics. We live at phonics time. And the teachers at my school were like, that's so weird. I think because the conception was that, it's boring or that students don't like it. But if it's engaging, then they absolutely do like it.
My first graders last year, whenever we would do a sentence for dictation, I'm like, okay, now we're going to write a sentence. They would cheer. I'm not even joking. They're like, what? And then they'd even ask me, are we doing a sentence today? They were
how motivating. And it's so applicable in everyday life, right? I love that you can do that. And I think what you said too about your attitude is so critical as well. Don't know.
I was just going to add that one of my adult students just said, we just had a tutoring session and we're doing phonics, folks, we're doing phonics. And the student at the end of the session says, I'm learning.
Love it.
I love that. And so the authors of this article point out in their evidence against that myth, or why it's a myth, they do cite some research that found positive effects on reading attainment, that phonics instruction is associated with greater motivation to read, more extensive reading for pleasure, and higher academic self-esteem.
So I think these myths are so there's people pushing back against the science of reading. And sometimes they'll say it's an ideology or it's just what they think. And here's a great article you can share with them. And even just this box, because it has the myths, because they're always stating these myths to try to push back. And this has the myths, and then it has, the references and the evidence right there for you to share with them.
Yeah, it goes to show the authors knew the importance of addressing that head on. They know their subject for sure. Well, can you guys believe that we're out of time? And that's just one section of the article, right? So we do have, next time, we are going to be addressing the section titled Becoming a Skilled Word Reader, pages 16 through 26. For those of you who are, you have a week, guys, you have a week to read it. There will be no quiz that we've prepared anyway. But we're in this next section, there's a lot to look forward to. This is where we talk about print exposure in conjunction with phonics instruction, right? And the main message is experience matters. So we get to talk about them applying it. And that's when, to me, the fun really gets amped up a bit. So I'm really excited to discuss that. Thank you all for joining us. We do look forward to hearing from you and how you're responding to this article. We'd love to hear it. So feel free to listen to the past episodes and join us for the next episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today for Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. We invite you to join the Science of Reading Collective, our free community and resource hub, so you can stay current with new ideas, free webinars, resources, and more. And be sure to visit Literacy Talks online for resources, access to every season's episodes, and more at readinghorizons.com/literacy talks. It's an exciting time to teach reading and ensure your students reach grade level proficiency this school year. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Join us next time.